Have you ever felt the exhausting weight of constantly correcting people's perceptions about who you are? Have you ever wondered what would happen if you just stopped explaining yourself to everyone who had an opinion about your life? Well, let me tell you what happened to me when I made that exact decision, and how it completely transformed my existence in ways I never could have imagined. My name doesn't matter for this story, but what does matter is that I spent the first 32 years of my life trapped in an invisible prison of my own making, desperately trying to convince everyone around me that they were wrong about who I was, what I wanted, and how I chose to live. I was drowning in explanations, suffocating under the pressure of perception, and slowly losing myself in the process of trying to make others understand me. This is the story of how I broke free, and I'm sharing it with you today because I know, deep in my soul, that someone out there needs to hear this. Someone is standing exactly where I was standing 3 years ago, exhausted and depleted, wondering if it's worth it to keep fighting against the tide of other people's assumptions. So let me take you back to where it all began, to the moment when I realized that the battle I was fighting wasn't worth winning, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is absolutely nothing at all. It started so innocuously that I barely noticed it at first. I was 29 years old, working as a freelance graphic designer from my small apartment in the city, and I had made the deliberate choice to remain single after a devastating breakup 2 years prior. I wasn't bitter or broken, despite what everyone seemed to think. I was healing, growing, rediscovering who I was outside of a relationship. But try explaining that to your concerned family members, your well-meaning friends, or your nosy coworkers who somehow feel entitled to have opinions about your personal life. My mother would call me every Sunday evening, and within the first 5 minutes of conversation, she would inevitably ask, with that particular tone of worry that only mothers can master, when I was going to start dating again. My aunts would corner me at family gatherings, whispering about how I was wasting my youth, how my biological clock was ticking, how I needed to get back out there before all the good ones were taken. My coupled-up friends would constantly try to set me up with random people they knew, convinced that I must be desperately lonely, that my life must feel empty and incomplete without a romantic partner. And every single time, I would launch into my well-rehearsed explanation about how I was actually quite happy, how I was focusing on my career and personal growth, how being single was a choice and not a tragedy. I would watch their faces as I spoke, seeing the polite nods that barely masked their disbelief, the sympathetic smiles that told me they thought I was just making excuses to hide my pain. I would feel my energy draining with every word, every attempt to justify my existence, every effort to convince them that I knew what was best for my own life. But it wasn't just my relationship status that people felt compelled to comment on and misunderstand. My career choices were another constant source of assumptions and unsolicited advice. Because I worked from home as a freelancer, people assumed I wasn't serious about my career, that I was just dabbling in design until I found a real job with a real company. My father would mention job openings at his firm during our phone calls, not understanding that I had deliberately chosen the freedom and flexibility of freelancing over the security and structure of traditional employment. Former colleagues would reach out on social media to ask if I was still doing that design thing, as if it were a temporary hobby rather than my actual profession. Friends would make casual comments about how nice it must be to not have to work that hard, completely oblivious to the fact that I often put in 60-hour weeks to build my client base and reputation. And again, I would explain. I would send lengthy messages detailing my business model, my client list, my income, my future plans. I would share my successes and achievements, hoping to validate my choices in their eyes. I would defend my decisions with facts and figures, trying to prove that I wasn't lazy or irresponsible or wasting my potential. The exhaustion was cumulative, building up day after day, conversation after conversation, until I felt like I was carrying the weight of the entire world's misunderstanding on my shoulders. Then there were the assumptions about my lifestyle, my choices, my values. Because I lived in a small apartment and didn't own a car, people assumed I was struggling financially. Because I spent my evenings reading and working on personal projects instead of going out to bars and clubs, people assumed I was antisocial or depressed. Because I chose to invest my money in experiences like travel and education rather than material possessions, people assumed I was impractical and irresponsible. Because I preferred deep conversations with a few close friends over large social gatherings, people assumed I was lonely and isolated. Every assumption felt like a tiny cut, and every explanation felt like trying to stop the bleeding with words that never quite did the job. I remember one particular evening, sitting at a dinner party hosted by an old college friend, when someone I barely knew spent 20 minutes explaining to me why I needed to buy property, get a corporate job, and settle down before it was too late. This stranger, who knew nothing about my financial situation, my goals, or my values, felt completely comfortable telling me exactly what was wrong with my life and how to fix it. And I sat there, fork in hand, feeling my chest tighten with frustration and resentment, launching into yet another explanation about my intentional choices and alternative lifestyle. I watched her face as I spoke, seeing the same polite disbelief I had seen 1,000 times before, and something inside me cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but like a hairline fracture in a glass that's been dropped one too many times. I drove home that night in borrowed car from a friend, and I felt something shifting inside me. The exhaustion had reached a critical point. I was tired of defending myself, tired of explaining, tired of trying to make people understand things they had already decided not to understand. I realized that I had been giving away my power, my peace, and my energy to people who had no real stake in my happiness or success. I had been allowing other people's limited perspectives to make me doubt my own truth, to question my own choices, to feel like I needed to justify my existence. That night, sitting in my small apartment with a cup of tea and the city lights twinkling outside my window, I made a decision that would change everything. I decided to stop correcting people's assumptions about my life. Just stop. Completely. No more explanations. No more justifications. No more desperate attempts to make people see me accurately. I would simply smile, nod, and let them believe whatever they wanted to believe. The decision felt terrifying and liberating at the same time, like standing at the edge of a cliff and choosing to jump without knowing if there was water below. I had no idea what would happen, no roadmap for this new approach to living. All I knew was that I couldn't continue the way I had been going. Something had to change, and that something was me. The first test came the very next Sunday when my mother called. Right on schedule, about 5 minutes into the conversation, she asked me if I had met anyone special lately. My heart started racing. Every fiber of my being wanted to launch into my usual explanation about how I was happy being single, how I was focusing on myself, how relationships weren't the only source of fulfillment in life. But instead, I took a deep breath and simply said, "Not yet, Mom," with a lightness in my voice that surprised even me. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear her processing this new response, this lack of defensive explanation. Then she said something about how it would happen when the time was right, and we moved on to other topics. The conversation lasted another 30 minutes, and not once did I feel that familiar exhaustion creeping in. Not once did I feel like I was defending my existence. When I hung up the phone, I sat in stunned silence, marveling at how different that interaction had felt. It was like I had discovered a secret door in a room I thought I knew completely. The relief was immediate and profound. I hadn't realized how much energy I had been expending on those explanations until I stopped giving them. Emboldened by this first success, I started applying the same principle to other areas of my life. When my father mentioned another job opening at his company, instead of explaining why corporate life wasn't for me, I simply thanked him for thinking of me and said I was happy with my current work situation. When friends made comments about my lack of social life, instead of defending my introversion and explaining my need for solitude, I just smiled and said I was doing well. Thanks for asking. When relatives raised their eyebrows at my small apartment and modest lifestyle, instead of justifying my financial priorities and explaining my values, I simply nodded and changed the subject. It felt strange at first, almost like I was being dishonest or inauthentic. There was a part of me that worried I was betraying myself by not correcting their misconceptions. But as the days turned into weeks, something remarkable began to happen. I started to feel lighter. The constant weight of other people's opinions began to lift from my shoulders. I found myself with more mental and emotional energy because I wasn't spending it all on defending and explaining. The space that had been occupied by anxiety about what others thought of me slowly began to fill with a deeper sense of peace and self-assurance. What surprised me most was how little it seemed to matter to other people. I had assumed that if I stopped correcting their assumptions, they would continue to pile on with more judgments and unwanted advice. But the opposite happened. When I stopped engaging with their assumptions, when I stopped giving them material to debate and discuss, they largely moved on to other topics. It was as if my defensive explanations had been fueling the fire of their concerns and opinions. Without that fuel, the fire simply went out. My mother still worried about me, I'm sure, but she stopped bringing up my single status in every conversation. My father still probably thought I should get a real job, but he stopped sending me job listings. My friends stopped trying to fix my social life when I stopped reacting to their concerns about it. The assumptions didn't disappear completely, but they lost their power over me because I stopped giving them my energy and attention. I realized that people's assumptions about my life said far more about their own fears, values, and perspectives than they said about me. My mother's concern about my relationship status came from her own belief that women needed partners to be complete. My father's worry about my career came from his generation's definition of success and security. My friends' comments about my lifestyle came from their own needs and preferences being projected onto me. Have you ever felt this way? Have you ever exhausted yourself trying to make people understand your choices? Comment below and let me know, because I think this is something so many of us experience but rarely talk about openly. As the weeks progressed, I began to notice changes not just in how others interacted with me, but in how I saw myself. When you stop constantly defending your choices, you stop questioning them as much. I had been so busy trying to convince everyone else that my life was valid and worthwhile that I had unconsciously been asking myself the same questions. Am I really happy being single? Or am I just afraid of getting hurt again? Is freelancing really fulfilling? Or am I just avoiding the structure and accountability of traditional employment? Is my lifestyle really intentional? Or am I just making excuses for not achieving conventional markers of success? These doubts had been lurking beneath the surface, fed by every conversation where I had to justify myself. But when I stopped explaining, I stopped questioning. The clarity that emerged was stunning. Without the noise of other people's opinions, I could hear my own voice more clearly. I could feel my own truth more deeply. I realized that I genuinely loved my life exactly as it was. The single status that everyone worried about had given me the space to heal, grow, and discover who I was outside of relationships. The freelance career that people questioned had given me freedom, flexibility, and creative fulfillment that no corporate job ever could. The simple lifestyle that seemed inadequate to others was actually rich with meaning, connection, and joy. I started to feel a profound shift in my relationship with myself. Instead of constantly looking outward for validation and approval, I began to look inward. I started trusting my own judgment more, valuing my own perspective above the well-meaning but ultimately irrelevant opinions of others. This wasn't about becoming arrogant or closed off to feedback. It was about recognizing the difference between constructive input from people who truly knew and understood me, and projection from people who were filtering my life through their own limited lens. I became more selective about whose opinions I actually cared about. There were a handful of people in my life whose perspectives I valued because they took the time to truly know me, to understand my goals and values, to support my growth even when it looked different from theirs. With these people, I remained open and honest, sharing my thoughts and feelings freely. But with everyone else, with the casual acquaintances and distant relatives and well-meaning strangers, I maintained a polite but firm boundary. Their assumptions were theirs to hold. I didn't need to correct them or convince them. I could simply let them be wrong and get on with living my life. The freedom was intoxicating. I felt like I had been released from an invisible cage that I hadn't even realized I was in. Suddenly, I had so much more time and energy for the things that actually mattered to me. I threw myself into my design work with renewed passion, taking on projects that excited and challenged me without worrying about whether they looked impressive to others. I deepened my relationships with the few friends who truly understood and accepted me, spending quality time with them instead of spreading myself thin across a wide network of superficial connections. I explored new hobbies and interests without concerning myself with whether they seemed productive or valuable by other people's standards. I took a pottery class just because I found it meditative and enjoyable, not because it would lead anywhere or impress anyone. I started learning Spanish through online lessons, motivated purely by my own interest in the language and culture, not by any external pressure or expectation. I began writing in a journal every morning, pouring out my thoughts and feelings onto the page without any audience or judgment. These activities filled my life with richness and meaning that had nothing to do with other people's approval. But perhaps the most unexpected benefit of my new approach was how it affected my professional life. When I stopped defending my choice to freelance, when I stopped trying to prove that my career was legitimate and successful, something shifted in how I presented myself to potential clients. I carried myself with more confidence and authority. I stopped apologizing for my rates or my processes. I stopped over-explaining my qualifications and experience. I simply showed up as the skilled professional I was, take it or leave it. And clients responded to this energy. My business actually grew in the months following my decision to stop correcting assumptions. I attracted higher quality clients who valued my expertise and were willing to pay premium rates for my work. I stopped wasting time on people who didn't respect what I did or who wanted to haggle over prices. The shift in my energy and self-perception had created a shift in my external reality. It was as if the universe had been waiting for me to truly believe in myself, before reflecting that belief back to me through opportunities and success. About 6 months into this new way of being, I had an encounter that really crystallized the transformation I had undergone. I ran into an old friend from college at a coffee shop, someone I hadn't seen in years. We sat down to catch up, and inevitably, the conversation turned to our lives and what we were doing. She asked about my relationship status, my career, my living situation, all the usual questions. And I watched myself respond with such ease and lightness. I shared what I wanted to share, kept private what I wanted to keep private, and felt no compulsion whatsoever to defend or justify any of it. At one point, she made a comment that would have triggered me immensely in the past. She said something about how she could never live the way I did, how she needed the security of a steady paycheck and a committed relationship to feel stable. The old me would have heard this as a judgment and launched into a defensive explanation. But the new me simply smiled and said, "That makes sense. We all need different things." The conversation flowed naturally after that, and when we parted ways, I felt energized rather than drained. Walking home, I reflected on how much had changed in such a relatively short time. The person I had been 6 months earlier would have left that coffee shop feeling misunderstood and defensive, probably spending the rest of the day replaying the conversation in my mind and thinking of all the things I should have said. But this new version of me felt peaceful and centered, completely unbothered by her perspective on my life. The transformation rippled out into other areas of my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. My creativity flourished when I stopped worrying about external validation. I started taking risks with my design work, experimenting with bold new styles and approaches that excited me even if they didn't fit conventional expectations. Some of these experiments failed spectacularly, but I didn't care because I wasn't performing for an audience. I was creating for the pure joy of creation. My health improved as my stress levels decreased. I had been carrying so much tension in my body from the constant need to defend and explain myself, and as that tension released, I noticed fewer headaches, better sleep, improved digestion. It was as if my physical body had been waiting for my mind and heart to let go of this burden. My relationship with my family evolved in unexpected ways. My mother and I actually grew closer when I stopped fighting with her about my life choices. Our conversations became more genuine and enjoyable because we weren't stuck in the same repetitive pattern of her expressing concern and me getting defensive. She still had her opinions, I'm sure, but she kept them to herself more, and I stopped taking her every comment as a personal attack. I also noticed that I became more compassionate and understanding toward others. When you stop being defensive about your own life, you stop being judgmental about other people's lives. I found myself extending the same grace to others that I wished they would extend to me. When friends made choices I didn't understand or agree with, instead of offering unsolicited advice or making assumptions, I simply supported them in their journey. I recognized that just as I wanted people to trust me to know what was best for my own life, others deserved that same trust. This shift made my relationships deeper and more authentic. People felt safer being vulnerable with me because they knew I wouldn't judge them or try to fix them. I became the kind of friend I had always wanted others to be to me. Someone who could hold space for complexity and uncertainty without needing to have all the answers. The irony wasn't lost on me that by caring less about what people thought of me, I had become more genuinely caring toward them. Do you find yourself judging others less when you worry less about their judgment of you? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Around the 1-year mark of this journey, I experienced what I can only describe as a full integration of this new way of being. It was no longer a conscious effort to not correct people's assumptions. It had become my natural state. I had retrained my brain and my nervous system to not react defensively to other people's opinions. I had built up such a strong foundation of self-trust and self-knowledge that external perspectives simply couldn't shake me the way they used to. This didn't mean I had become cold or indifferent. I still cared deeply about the people in my life. I still valued connection and community. But I had learned to separate caring about people from caring about their opinions of me. I could love someone and completely disagree with their assessment of my life. I could cherish a relationship while maintaining firm boundaries around my autonomy and choices. This balance felt like the ultimate expression of emotional maturity and self-respect. During this time, I also started noticing something interesting happening with the people who had been most concerned about my unconventional life. Some of them actually started making changes in their own lives, questioning the assumptions they had been living under. My mother, who had been so worried about me being single, mentioned during one phone call that she sometimes envied my independence and freedom. My father, who had been concerned about my lack of corporate career, admitted that he sometimes wondered what his life would have been like if he had pursued his own creative interests instead of following the traditional path. Friends who had pitied my small apartment and simple lifestyle started talking about feeling overwhelmed by their mortgages and possessions, expressing a desire for more simplicity. It was as if my refusal to defend my choices had given them permission to question their own. By not engaging in debate about whose life was better or more valid, I had inadvertently created space for them to examine their own assumptions and conditioning. This was never my intention. I had no agenda to convert anyone to my way of living, but it happened organically as a side effect of my authenticity and self-assurance. There were still challenging moments, of course. The path wasn't always smooth or easy. There were times when someone's assumption about my life stung more than I wanted to admit. Moments when I had to actively resist the urge to defend and explain. I remember a family reunion about 18 months into my journey, where a distant uncle made a comment about how I was wasting my potential and my life. For a split second, I felt that old familiar anger rising up, that desperate need to make him understand. But I took a breath, I felt my feet on the ground, and I simply smiled and said, "I appreciate your concern," before walking away to join a different conversation. Later that evening, I sat alone in my hotel room and cried. Not because his words had changed how I felt about my life, but because it still hurt to be so fundamentally misunderstood by people who were supposed to be family. I allowed myself to feel that hurt fully, to honor the part of me that still wished everyone could see and appreciate who I really was. And then I let it go. I reminded myself that his inability to understand my life was not my problem to solve. I had no obligation to make myself small or conventional to ease his discomfort with my choices. These moments of difficulty actually strengthened my resolve and deepened my practice. Each time I successfully resisted the urge to defend myself, each time I chose peace over being right, I was reinforcing new neural pathways and emotional patterns. I was teaching myself at the deepest level that my worth and the validity of my choices were not dependent on anyone else's understanding or approval. This lesson extended beyond just handling assumptions about my personal life. It started influencing how I showed up in all areas. In my business, I stopped over-explaining my creative decisions to clients who questioned them. I learned to say, "Trust me, this is going to work," with calm confidence instead of defensive justification. In friendships, I stopped apologizing for my boundaries or making excuses when I needed alone time. I simply stated my needs clearly and directly, without elaborate explanations. In family relationships, I stopped trying to change people's minds about who I was and simply showed up as my authentic self, regardless of how they chose to perceive me. This consistency across all areas of my life created a powerful alignment. I was finally living with integrity, which I came to understand meant that my internal sense of self matched how I presented to the world, regardless of how others interpreted it. The 2-year anniversary of my decision to stop correcting assumptions felt like a milestone worth acknowledging, at least privately. I had transformed so completely that sometimes I barely recognized the person I used to be. That exhausted, defensive, approval-seeking version of myself felt like a distant memory. I had grown into someone who was genuinely comfortable in her own skin, someone who knew her own mind and trusted her own path, someone who could witness other people's judgments and remain utterly unmoved. But this transformation hadn't made me hard or closed off. If anything, I had become softer and more open, because I no longer felt the need to protect myself from every perceived criticism. I could receive feedback without taking it as an attack. I could hear someone's concern without interpreting it as a judgment. I had developed what I can only describe as a healthy detachment from outcomes and perceptions. I cared deeply about living well and doing good work, but I didn't care about convincing anyone else that I was living well or doing good work. This detachment created space for genuine curiosity and growth. Without the defensive walls I had been maintaining, I could actually hear when someone offered a perspective that was valuable and relevant. I became better at discerning between projection and wisdom, between assumptions based on someone's own fears and insights based on genuine observation and care. There were people in my life whose feedback I actively sought out because I trusted their judgment and valued their perspective. These were people who had taken the time to know me deeply, who understood my goals and values, who could see things I couldn't see because they weren't blinded by my own biases and blind spots. With these people, I remained completely open and receptive. But I had learned to immediately identify the difference between this kind of valuable input and the superficial assumptions of people who barely knew me. This discernment was a skill I had developed through practice and experience, and it served me incredibly well. As I approached the 3-year mark, I found myself reflecting on all the ways this one decision had transformed my life. I was healthier, happier, more successful, more creative, more connected to the people who really mattered. My business had grown beyond what I had imagined possible. My relationships had deepened and become more authentic. My sense of self had become unshakable. I had more energy, more peace, more joy. And all of this had come from the simple act of stopping, of ceasing the exhausting effort to control other people's perceptions. The paradox was beautiful. By caring less about what people thought, I had created a life that I absolutely loved. A life that needed no defense or justification because it was so clearly aligned with my values and desires. I had discovered that the approval I had been seeking so desperately from others could only ever come from within. And once I gave that approval to myself, once I validated my own choices and my own path, external validation became completely unnecessary. I won't pretend that every assumption people make about me rolls off my back without any impact. I'm human, and there are still moments when someone's words sting or when I feel frustrated by being misunderstood. But these moments are fleeting now, and they no longer have the power to derail me or make me doubt myself. I have built such a strong foundation of self-knowledge and self-trust that it would take a lot more than someone's uninformed opinion to shake it. I know who I am. I know what I want. I know what brings me joy and fulfillment. And I know that I don't owe anyone an explanation for any of it. This knowledge is my anchor, keeping me steady when the winds of judgment and assumption blow my way. It's the source of my peace and my power. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in my story, if you're exhausted from constantly defending and explaining your life to people who will never fully understand it, I want you to know that there's another way. You don't have to convince anyone that your choices are valid. You don't have to make people see you accurately. You can simply let them hold their assumptions while you get on with the beautiful business of living your life on your own terms. It's scary at first, I won't lie to you. It feels vulnerable and exposed to stop defending yourself, like you're surrendering some kind of battle. But what you're actually doing is reclaiming your power. You're taking back all that energy you've been giving away and redirecting it toward things that actually serve you. You're choosing peace over being right, freedom over approval, authenticity over acceptance. And I promise you, from the other side of this transformation, it is so worth it. The life I live now is not perfect by anyone's standards, including my own. I still face challenges and setbacks. I still make mistakes and have moments of doubt. But the difference is that I'm living my own life now, not a performance of what I think others want to see. I'm making choices based on what feels true and right for me, not on what will be easiest to defend to others. I'm building a life that reflects my values, my desires, my unique way of being in the world, and I'm doing it all without the crushing weight of other people's assumptions and expectations on my shoulders. The lightness, the freedom, the joy that comes from this way of living is beyond what I ever imagined possible. It's like I've been given a second chance at life, an opportunity to start over with wisdom I didn't have before. So here's what I want you to take away from my story. Your life is yours to live, not your mother's, not your father's, not your friends' or your coworkers' or society's. Yours. And you are the only one who gets to decide if you're living it well. Other people's assumptions about you are not facts. They're stories they tell themselves based on their own limited perspective and their own fears and conditioning. You don't have to accept these stories as truth. You don't have to correct them or fight against them. You can simply let them exist while you focus your energy on creating a life you love. The people who truly matter, the ones who really see you and value you, they'll understand. And the ones who don't understand? That's okay too. You can love them, appreciate them, maintain relationships with them, all while recognizing that their opinion of your life doesn't determine its value or validity. I challenge you today to think about where you're exhausting yourself trying to correct people's assumptions. Where are you defending, explaining, justifying your choices to people who haven't earned the right to question them? What would happen if you just stopped? What energy would be freed up? What peace would become available to you? What version of yourself might emerge if you weren't constantly worried about being misunderstood? I encourage you to experiment with this, even in small ways. The next time someone makes an assumption about your life that isn't accurate, instead of launching into your usual explanation, just smile and let it go. Notice how that feels in your body. Notice what happens in the conversation. Notice what happens in your relationship with yourself. I think you might be surprised at what you discover. Living through these past 3 years has taught me that the most radical thing you can do in a world that constantly demands explanations and justifications is to simply be yourself without apology or explanation. It's an act of rebellion against a culture that wants you to shrink yourself to fit into neat, understandable categories. It's a declaration that you trust yourself more than you trust other people's judgments of you. It's a commitment to living authentically, even when it makes others uncomfortable. And it's the path to a kind of freedom and peace that cannot be found through any amount of external validation or approval. This is the truth I've discovered, the truth I'm living now, the truth I wanted to share with you today. I hope my story has resonated with you in some way. I hope it's given you something to think about, maybe even inspired you to make some changes in your own life. If you've ever felt the exhaustion of constantly explaining yourself, if you've ever wished you could just be understood without having to work so hard for it, if you've ever wondered what life would be like if you stopped caring so much about other people's opinions, please share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single comment, and I love hearing about your experiences and perspectives. Your story matters just as much as mine does, and I believe we all have so much to learn from each other's journeys. Have you experienced something similar in your own life? Have you made the decision to stop correcting people's assumptions? Or are you still in the thick of it, exhausting yourself with explanations? Let me know in the comments. Let's start a conversation about this because I truly believe that sharing our stories is how we help each other grow and heal. Understanding the power of letting go of other people's opinions isn't just helpful, it's transformative. It can literally change the trajectory of your entire life, just like it changed mine. The freedom that comes from living authentically, from trusting yourself more than you trust others' judgments, from choosing peace over being right, this freedom is available to all of us. But it requires courage. It requires us to step outside of the conditioning we've received about needing approval and validation from others. It requires us to build our own internal compass and trust it, even when it points in a direction that others don't understand. This is deep work, important work, life-changing work. And it starts with the simple decision to stop explaining yourself to people who have already made up their minds about who you are. If this story touched your heart, if it made you feel something, if it reminded you that you're not alone in your struggles with other people's assumptions and expectations, please hit that like button. It helps more people find this story, and you never know who might need to hear it today. Someone out there is feeling exactly what you're feeling, struggling with exactly what you're struggling with, and your engagement with this content helps it reach them. That matters more than you might realize. And if you want to hear more stories like this, real stories about real struggles and real transformations, stories that remind you that you're not alone in this messy, beautiful journey of being human, then please subscribe to Living Through It. This channel is dedicated to sharing authentic experiences and hard-won wisdom, to creating a community of people who are committed to living consciously and courageously, to supporting each other through the challenges and celebrating each other through the victories. We're all living through something, and we're all doing the best we can with what we have. Let's do it together. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. I post new content regularly, and each story is carefully crafted to offer something valuable, whether that's inspiration, validation, practical wisdom, or just the comfort of knowing you're not alone. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my story today. Thank you for being here, for being open, for being willing to consider a different way of living. Thank you for being part of this community. Your presence matters, your story matters, and I'm honored that you spent this time with me. Remember, you don't owe anyone an explanation for living your life on your own terms. You don't have to convince anyone that your choices are valid. You can simply let people hold their assumptions while you focus on creating a life that feels true and right and beautiful to you. The freedom is yours for the taking. All you have to do is stop defending and start living. I believe in you, I'm rooting for you, and I can't wait to hear about your journey in the comments below. Until next time, keep living through it, keep growing through it, and keep trusting yourself above all else. You've got this.